demonstrating what that meant. As in theater and opera and ballet, and as Dan and I were talking earlier, it's amazing how he came to this, just in knowing that he was drawn to art. How was that? At a very young age, you just knew you wanted to get into the drama, you wanted to sing. Tell us more about that.
All right. So I grew up in the middle of nowhere, Minnesota, the grade school in central Minnesota, and then my family moved up to farm country in northwestern Minnesota. My dad's a Methodist minister, my mom's a school teacher, my mom's pretty arty. My dad is, besides being a preacher, a pretty good singer. So I grew up around all of this stuff, and I remember my mom dragging us to the junior high when we were little kids to like play with clay and throw stuff on the wheel and all of that. So I always kind of doodled and did that, but never really had any formal art training at that point. I sang. I don't do that anymore. You should be happy to know that
you wouldn't sing a line from Oklahoma?
Well, we'll see.
It was in Oklahoma.
Right.
And
So
I signed in Otterbein, Oklahoma.
Right. So yeah, I did a bunch of this stuff in school, and I sang in choirs. I ended up singing in the Minnesota All-State Choir, a bunch of things. And some friends of mine, we had a great drama teacher when I was in high school who conned me into auditioning for the musical. And I thought, why not? Right, I'll give this a try. And I was cast as Curly in Oklahoma. So the first show I ever auditioned for, I'm the lead in the musical. And I thought, well, shoot, this is easy. Then I did a bunch of plays in high school in the community theater. My brothers and I and my mom, typical community theater. We were in there helping out painting, building scenery, although scenery as I understand it now is nothing, those two things don't really compare, right? We would take a bunch of flats and like paint a little something on them and like call that, Laurie's house, right? And which is not really what I do much of anymore. And so I didn't really know what I do now was actually a real job, right? And I'm sure there are people who are not entirely sure what I do now is really a job. So I went away to college, and I went to a nice little, basically it's a school a lot like Otterbein in St. Paul, Minnesota, called Hamlin University. But I went there thinking I was going to be a lawyer, because I didn't want to be a farmer, I didn't want to be a minister, I wasn't going to be a doctor. I was like, okay, lawyer. So, and they had it was a Methodist school, might have had some association with it. Anyway, after about a semester and a half in the pre-law program, it was pretty clear to me and another good friend of mine, we were not in the right room. So then I was a music major for about a year. I gave a recital, and remember in the middle of this recital thinking, I'm singing away, right? I'm like, yeah, this is not going well. And so then it was like, and I had auditioned for, the first show I ever auditioned for in college, I didn't get cast in. It's like, don't you really know who it's like, I'm a talented thespian, don't you know? But what started happening is in Minneapolis there is one of the premier regional theaters in the United States, right? Which is the Guthrie Theater in Minneapolis, at the time I was there, I mean, they've always done terrific work, but at the time I was there, they had a terrific artistic director, this crazy man from Romania called Liviu Ciulei, and the things that I mean, the performance obviously was terrific, right? But the things that I started seeing on the stage, the environment that surrounded and was really integral to these performances, I became fascinated with this. And I was fairly handy, and I could like draw some things. And we had a really terrific department at Hamlin, so I just immersed myself in that. And within a year and a half, then I was a theater major after my first stagecraft class. I made this like totally detailed model for Harold Pinter's play The Birthday Party, and it had working drawers. It was like, that part wasn't important, right? But I was so fascinated by that. And I remember going into the small department, so it was a designer and technical director. He was the whole design department. And I remember going into his office as like, do you think I can do this professionally? And he's, I mean, now I think of that question as like, that is so naive, right? But I was fascinated by this. So I did a ton of work, just tons, and lived in the theater. My grades went, but I still, managed to graduate, managed to get into a good graduate school, went off to Massachusetts to go to graduate school. So that was then the intensive training. And then after I finished graduate school, I moved to New York. And because, and I had never had any intention of living in New York and working in New York. I followed my girlfriend, not the lovely Mrs. Gray.
What?
Yeah. All will be revealed. Going to New York, like I said, I had no intention of being there, but I got a job at a professional theater in New Jersey. Was a properties master, which was basically if we were designing this as a stage set, this easel, these chairs, the tables, the coffee maker and cups, all of that would be the properties, right? The stuff actors sit in, or dresses, the stage, whatever. So I didn't know that was like a real professional job. So I did that. I was designing. I left that theater after 2 seasons. I did a lot of scene painting, right? Which is a class I was just teaching this morning. I should back up and say I teach at The Ohio State University, and so this morning I was teaching a scene painting class, and I'll leave here and go teach an intro to design class. I then assisted a prominent New York designer for about 1.5 years on projects for a really bad project for Broadway that nobody ever heard of. It's kind of like historically bad, but I have that credit. Things for New York City Opera, but mostly this place called the Paper Mill Playhouse out in Millburn, New Jersey, which is basically Broadway for people who don't want to leave Jersey. They have, and at that time, they had 40,000 subscribers.
Wow.
I mean, think about that. And I was there from like 1989 to 1991. I worked on shows there. I wasn't designing them, right? I was drawing stuff for the designer, building models for the designer. But I worked on shows that had budgets of $500,000 to $1 million for the scenery, right? There was a show I worked on where it came back from the shop, right? They had their own shop to build these things. The bids came back a little high, and one of the portions of it is there was $35,000 in molding that we had spec'd for this, right? We just had these catalogs that were like, yeah, this look great. Anyway, so we got to trim that away. But that was like a PhD program for me, right? This is where I learned about the business of doing theater. And the other thing I learned about the business of doing theater is I didn't want to be in New York doing the business of doing theater. So I had an opportunity to come out here and interview for Players Theater, if anybody remembers Players Theater, which is where I met Mary. Mary was working at Players when I got here, and they were looking for a resident designer, and I was looking for an opportunity to design full-time. So I came out here, I worked for Players for 2 full seasons, and the start of the 3rd season when the theater closed. At that time I was designing the biggest thing I had ever done, which was Phantom, which was supposed to be on stage when the theater closed. So I've been doing this professionally, designing exclusively professionally for almost 30 years, which is hard to imagine. Frankly. When the theater closed, I got the job at Ohio State, so I've been at Ohio State now 22 years. And, you know, I've designed probably a couple hundred shows. I'm not going to show you all of them. My intention is to walk through a little bit of the process, right? Like how does this happen, right? I mean, it's and just kind of walk you through like how I think about this stuff and what I think is important, because playwrights describe the world of the play, right? Some in some detail, some in less detail, and then it's incumbent upon a designer and a team, right? I work with costume designer, lighting designer, sound designer, media designer. There's a whole group of people who then take the design that gets presented, and the director, sorry, right. Let's change the order of this, right? So anyway, you know, for me, it all starts with the play. When I say the play, you could insert the ballet, the opera, libretto. It's the thing, right? The text, the idea that we start with. And one of the things that I always talk about with students is, it's not an entirely esoteric thing, which is part of the distinction between what I do as a designer and what a fine artist might do, right? Fine artists make something. We can argue about like what is art and like what is you know, what's good art. We don't have time for that. But you know, this is not what I do. It's like but if you do a painting, right, and you love it and you hang it on your wall, that's all it has to do, right? It doesn't have to have a particular function, right? So when I think about design, the big difference for me is design. I mean, there is a function for whatever we design, and my students get really tired of me talking about chairs, so I'm not going to talk like a lot about chairs, but chair has a function, right? And if you can design the most extraordinary object, but if it doesn't, if you can't sit in it, it's not a very good chair, right? So for me, how that translates is we have this play, we have this idea, and part of what I do is, you know, I'm part of the storytelling process, right? We're there to tell a story, And so I need to make sure that my integrated piece of it helps us tell that story. And also allows the play to happen. Right? I've seen some beautiful things on stages like, this has nothing to do with play. Right? And so, actually maybe so I've been reviewed exactly one time in the New York Times. And it was this little show off Broadway, really interesting play. But the reviewer said, the scenery by Mr. Gray was unobtrusive. All right, well, it didn't get in the way. So that was good. I've had worse reviews. I'll take that. So part of it for me is we start with an idea, right? We read the play, we are, we're thinking about this, and usually there are a couple of layers to it, right? There's the plot, right? It's like what happens. This person comes in, this action happens, they leave, that this. So that's the sort of what happens part, which is important, right? If somebody has to get locked in the bathroom, that's an important part of it. But the thing that sort of drives the more aesthetic part of it, why does it look like this part, is what are the big ideas in this play? What's this play really about? And then how can we visually represent those ideas? So, and that's not necessarily the stuff that's directly in the script, right? Which is described in the text. It's usually in there somewhere. Right, so Mary and I are working on our first project together, like in forever. It's this play at Catco, opens March 20th. It's a contemporary retelling of Chekhov's play Uncle Vanya. And it has the charming title of Life Sucks. Hey. But it's also beautiful, right? And it's a play about love and loss and these people in these complicated relationships. And they say in the play, at one point one of the characters literally turns around and says, I suppose you're wondering, not to give anything away, but I suppose you're wondering why it is all deconstructed like this. It's like, oh, okay, I better make sure that can happen, right? And part of the metaphor, part of this play is about love and loss and longing and disappointment. And so part of my visual metaphor for this is that I want to design a lovely prison. Right? So, so if you see it, I'm not going to show you that, because, but the ideas really sprang from, it wants to be this lovely home, somewhere in the U.S., but the research I did is all based around Russian dachas, D-A-C-A, dachas, right, Russian country homes. So all of the details in it are really based on that. But it's not all there, and it's, I'm accenting the verticals and doing blah, blah, blah. It's all kind of stuff. Okay. So it starts with conversations. We talk about these ideas. I start to gather up then a bunch of research. Some of it is based on the text. If I'm designing a play by Tennessee Williams. Right? Tennessee Williams' work is almost entirely autobiographical. So knowing a little bit about Tennessee Williams helps me understand why it is in this place. Right? So Chekhov, understanding what he was writing about helps me do that. But then I do a ton of visual research. Like I have never been to Venice, Italy, or California. But but if we're doing a play set in Venice, I need to know what that looks like. And I have a friend who is a technical director. They're the people who engineer and build it. He used to love to give me grief. He's like, and he's a good friend of mine. He's like, yeah, Dan doesn't really design anything. He just finds a bunch of pictures of things he likes, and kind of mashes it up together and calls it design it. And he's not wrong, right? But that's like, some of you have been to Venice, so if I'm going to put that on stage, it probably should look, at least reference that, even if we decide it's not that. Okay? So, I'm just going to walk, if you don't mind, I'm just going to walk you through a couple of examples of what I might present, like point at some of the research, and then like why this stuff ends up on stage. Does that seem okay? Okay, and it's a little pixelated, so maybe it looks better from where you're sitting. A couple of things. So this is a play, Bengal Tiger at the Baghdad Zoo. Robin Williams was in this play on Broadway. It was written by, God, I should remember his name, Rajiv something from, he's originally from Cleveland. So this play is an existential drama. And this is based around actual events. So during the occupation of Baghdad, right, the fall of Baghdad, there were U.S. Marines in Baghdad. Some of them were assigned to guard the zoo, right, this valuable asset. And they got a little bored. They started teasing the tiger. They were like, in the play, they like tease him and like get him to try to eat this Slim Jim, and the tiger is like Robin Williams, right? You can imagine, like, what are these morons doing, right? And he's not dressed up as a tiger, it's just like this old scruffy guy. But in real life, they were doing this, and the tiger bit off the guy's hand. And then they shot the tiger, right? Because, anyway. So the story is sort of this existential crisis, like, the tiger is having, and he comes back as a sort of ghost. But then it's a lot about the fall of Baghdad, and Saddam Hussein and Uday Hussein are part of this. Pretty awful things happen. I don't know, did anybody ever see this play? Yeah. There are a lot of layers to it, and trying to capture that. So here's some of the research and design ideas. One was it was at Studio 2 at Catco. So it is a small space. There's not any room to really change scenery around. So we're trying to create a simple, flexible space, sense of Baghdad, without getting too specific about location. Because it had to go like 8 different places. So one of the things is, if you try to get too specific, then if you're, in this place, it doesn't look like that thing. So like you really have to have a director and actors that commit to this idea. Topiary will always be present in some sort of silent witness to the proceedings. Part of what's in the play is there's this guy who's a gardener, and one of the ironies is he makes animals out of bushes, right? Which is sort of resonates back to the idea of the animals in the zoo and this kind of artificial creation. So that was going to be an important thing. We thought the idea of some of them hanging above the action in the catwalk was going to be interesting. So I stowed that away. There's a line in the play about algebra. About hey, did you know that the algebra came from the Arabic al-jabir, a reunion of broken parts. All right, I didn't know that. And I'll take their word for it. Okay, so this became an important sort of visual metaphor, right? And it gave us license to. We knew it was going to be bombed out, but it was somehow it had to be cohesive around these broken parts. So I go, sorry, go forward. Maybe this one. Oh, okay. Any questions while I'm slowing down here?
Here you go.
All right. Great.
How about that?
So, okay, where do I start? These are Bengal tigers at Baghdad Zoo. Right. These were some of them. Here's our U.S. Marine out there guarding this. Next. I started to get intrigued with this idea of these Arabic Islamic screens, and some of these actually are from India, but I love this sort of beautiful barrier, this perforation, and there was this also thinking about how light could transform these things. So this, you'll see some of this when we get further into it. So Islam says here, light symbolizes God. The Quran states God is the light and heavens of the earth. You can read this, right? So this notion of an architectural articulation that resonates with this. There's a lot of talk about the Quran in this. So this was, again, a piece of research that was intriguing. Love the look of this, the light playing across this surface. Now, mind you, I am not the lighting designer. So this is a big piece of what I do is collaboration. I don't tell them, in the best of all possible worlds, I'm not telling them what to do, right? We're talking about how can we make this sort of look and effect. But as soon as I present this to a director, I better be pretty clear that this can happen. Okay. So actually, this is the screen pattern that we ended up with, and I love this sort of silhouetted form behind this screen. This is from the Islamic tomb. This is actually in Agra, India. Okay. Floor patterns. In this theater, a big part of the visual space is what happens on the floor. Right, this is in a proscenium theater, that picture frame, it's more about like what's back in behind. Okay. This was a lot about the floor, so like the play, the floor patterns are complex, overlapping, interlaced, meditative, like the story we're telling. So these are, again, kind of inspirational jumping off points. So I actually bought a book that has a bunch of these patterns in it. This was a piece of research. This is the floor at Uday Hussein's palace. I should tell you there's a big part of what happens in this. Some guy stole the gold toilet seat from Uday Hussein's palace, and he really wants to get this thing back. So that's a big piece of what happens here. Right. And I love this idea, this sort of broken pattern and kind of patching things up, this fragmented look. And again, this is what I'm showing directors and other designers, like literally this note, right? This is something I really like. So this was after some preliminary work. So this ended up being the floor tile layout, which we actually used for the play. Right, so it's taking all this stuff and then adapting it to the space. So my friend Chris was not wrong, right? I find this stuff and then I figure out how the heck I'm going to use it. Okay? Because as my designer advisor used to say to me, he's like, Jesus, Dan, where's your research? You can't just make this stuff up. And I thought I was going to be in the business of making stuff up. So anyway, And this was a piece of research actually that the director, a friend of mine, Mo Ryan, brought to the table. She had seen this and she loved the look of this, the complexity and overlapping. So just exactly the same things we were talking about in the floor. Now we see it in the rubble here. So I used a piece of this pretty much directly from this. Okay, so yeah.
How could someone get beauty out of that?
Well, it depends on how you treat it and how you light it. And frankly, the play wasn't all about beauty.
Right. Okay.
So,
You know, because some people would be upset seeing a wreck and something that exploded like that, bombed out.
which was all part of the play.
Okay.
Yeah. So, and you know, frankly, I do a lot of work where it's not all really lovely and nice.
Yeah, you know, I've seen the guy riding up the wall of this beautiful wall there on a bicycle. And, you know, I see people out there with graffiti and they're spraying stuff on buildings. Some people call it art. Some people call it, you know, something else.
Yeah.
Yeah, you know, I'm a real estate, you know, I know real estate people. Oh my blanky blank, I have to spend $5,000 to get it off the wall.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you know, and yeah.
But this is stage designing, right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Okay,
So,
we're in the right place.
yes.
Okay.
Yeah. So
But I do like the bicycle going up the wall.
yeah. Well, so I didn't use this part.
But I'm looking at the beautiful wall there and saying he's destroying the wall.
It was already destroyed.
It depends on who you're talking to. Maybe they can restore the whole building, but now he's adding to the damage.
Okay. Well, I don't want to debate restoration and all of this. What I want to tell you about is like how the stuff that I grabbed out of here to create the composition. So the thing that I found really intriguing actually was this, which this guy had actually put up in here to do this, but one of the places they go in this environment is they had to go to a hospital. The guy who gets his hand bit off, who's being fitted for a prosthetic, ends up in the hospital. I had no way to, and it would have been totally out of place to suddenly wheel to try to make a literal hospital on stage. So what we ended up with, and I'll show you here in a moment, is so the conceit was it was all in this rubble and wreckage. Okay. And the hospital bed was him laying on this door. We put a sheet over him. And if the actors commit to that being a hospital bed, if the director is committed to the idea of that being a hospital bed, then we hope that you as the audience believe it's a hospital bed. That's the perfect resolution of that. Sometimes you might look at it as like, why the hell's that guy laying on a door on the floor and they think he's in a hospital? Right. So that part of, you may have heard around this, is the notion of a willing suspension of disbelief. Right? I'm coming into a theater, I want you to like tell me a story, and I'm willing to go along for the ride. Right? That's part of what can make my job easier. What makes my job harder is not everybody wants to go on that ride. Or I put something on stage that is either anachronistic, it's wrong, it doesn't help tell the story. So I try to avoid that.
Basically, you want to get like a musician, you know, a person that does magic, you want to present them believing what they're seeing, but into their mind's eye.
Yeah. So part of this is, and some of it is sleight of hand, right? It's like, we want you to look where we want you to look. Right? So well, let's go to the next, and I'll show you sort of how we use this. So here's research on the topiary animals. So here's a guy actually in Baghdad, like taking care of these things. These became important as part of the backing of stuff. Okay, go ahead. More of them. I love this look of this. Part of this is they're dying. The topiary animals, and it's part of the symbol of the decay, right? Which was good for us because it was a lot easier to sort of make these kind of wireframe things and then, you know, not spend 3/4 of the budget on this. Because that's the other piece of this is you come up with all these ideas and then you figure out, can we do it, right? I mean, the ideas are great, but anyway, this perforated incomplete look. And the thing I tell my students all the time is you have to have a reason, right? Nothing should end up on that stage that you haven't thought about, right? It doesn't happen by accident. So that gets back to the design and the function piece of it. More of them, we ended up using some of these things, and there was a monkey like this sort of hanging underneath the bottom of the grid. So this stuff really was all over the place. And we were trying to figure out how do we immerse the audience in the sensation that they're in this. And this, right, this is not any of that stuff I've shown you, but we kind of like this idea of these things glowing at a certain point. There are these ibises, which are these sacred birds which make this return trip, and that was part of the reclamation idea in this as well. Okay. I needed a piece at the center of the stage. I couldn't put a cage out there for the tiger. Right? I have no room, and honestly, that's just the first piece of the play. And then, so we thought about putting a chest out there that he could use, literally get up on it, and he talks about, I am in this cage. And those damn lions get to run around all over the place. I'm in this cage. Right? I don't need to put bars on it. I mean, it's him talking about the experience. So I designed this chest, which was really a platform, and I would love it if we could have made this. You'll see what we made, but it's all based on these ideas, and these were Islamic chest Quran storage. Okay, and at one point they opened up the lid of this, and we had light inside it, and this light, holy sort of light, emanated up out of it. So, yeah. More architecture, right? So, go ahead. So here it is on stage, under stage light. So here's that bombed out bit that we talked about. Here is the version of the chest. Here's the guy with his prosthetic hand that once that had got bitten off. Here's the door in the rubble. Okay? There is a desk over here, which was just a slab of, wasn't real concrete, but there was some real concrete blocks around here. At some point, they go to an office, right? So I didn't want to make an office with a real desk. It was this slab on top of this thing and this chair, which looked like it was just part of the rubble until somebody picked it up and sat on it and then starts doing the work, right? Again, you believe it if we act like it, that's what's happening. We hope. Again, the magic doesn't always happen. So here are these screens, there are these topiaries. This was one in a pot that looked like a horse. You can see, oh, there's another picture where you can see some of the ones up here. So these screens, these moved, open, close to create entrances. So the conceit was so the folks who were sort of alive came from here, and the folks who were dead sort of came from here. This, I can tell you, here's a little bit of technology. So now we were able to take this. I never had to really do a drawing of this. We had a digital drawing made. I'm terrible at this, but a friend of mine turned this into a digital thing. We sent it off to a CNC router, a computerized machine that can take a sheet of 4x8 material and cut this pattern in it precisely, which is way cheaper than paying anybody to go. Okay. So that's the other part of it is, how do we make it, right? And so I sort of think about that, but we have somebody else who thinks about that. So here's what the gold gun from. This is also a big part of it with the desk. You can see a little bit more of the detail here. This is, you can see this lit up, right? So it bears some resemblance to that piece of research I showed you. This I-beam is not metal, right? It's wood, textured, treated to look like metal. All of this stuff is styrofoam, which is chipped up and covered basically with a roofing compound that we throw some sawdust in and make it look kind of stucco-y, textury. Yes, but does anybody have any questions about what I've been showing you?
I'm just curious, is there some standard percentage of a production budget that they like to say is scenery, or does it just?
So it's a bit of it's not totally complicated, right? Every producing agency has a certain budget. You break that down, we have this much budget for this show. So what you're hoping is that they're looking at this show requires a lot of scenery or period costumes that we have to build all of these things, and then divvies up the pie in that way, right? But I can tell you this, I've never worked anywhere where they said, don't worry about it. Except maybe paper mill, which was, it seemed to, let's see, can we scroll down? Actually, let's just go to the portfolio. This one that says portfolio. All right, so now I've walked you through the process. You've seen the way I use the research. So now I'm just going to show you some pictures of some stuff because I blabbed on way too long about the first show. That happens, but you get the idea. So this was a show I also did at Catco. This is in their small proscenium theater. This is a really wonderfully awful play about this writer and these series of murders that happen to young children, and he writes these cautionary tales for kids, and everything goes really bad. It's like really awful Grimm's fairy tales. So what I wanted to do when the audience came in is make you think you were going to see this lovely story about it looks like a children's book illustration, right? It doesn't take long before that. So the show starts, this goes away and reveals. So here are two sketches. So part of the idea phase of this is I do all this research and then I start to put them into sketches. So this is, you guys have seen this a million times, right? This is a interrogation room. Right? This cliche of the single light bulb, and anyway. So this guy's been called into this interrogation room. This interrogation room eventually transforms into a prison cell, and things just go downhill from here. So that's the sketch. You could trust me that there was research that went with it. So here you can see it in performance. So concrete walls, drain in the floor, kind of mysterious. Why is that there? That's not part of the floor of the theater. This is, I want you to, and there's a bit of blood staining around this, I want you to think about what might have happened here. Okay. Anyway, here we are in the prison cell. And in between these things, they play out some of these horrific stories. And they're all supposed to look like children's book illustrations. And again, it doesn't end well for her. It doesn't end well for him in this story. But again, I'm trying to set up this sort of visual dissonance. Anyway, let's look at something more lovely. There you go. I just want to show you I can do pretty too. So, anyway, this was a production, a co-production with Catco, Opera Columbus, and Phoenix Theater. This was a production of Secret Garden with both hearing and deaf actors. Part of the design was, so it was this series of screens. These were all computer printed on perforated vinyl, this sort of stuff you see around building sites. There's a material we use in theater called scrim, which allows you, if you light it from the front, it looks solid. If you light it, somebody behind it, she's standing behind this. Right, so you can sort of magically frame her in this. Okay? This is a good example. This is what these actually look like. So the color taken out of them, they look like this when they were under light. Okay. So here you can see one of the actors voicing for this. There's a bedroom up here. You can see the railings on this are all based on sort of tree branch bushes, sort of this lovely filigree kind of frame around here. Nice. This was when they opened to get into the Secret Garden, which was down here. These platforms here, part of this is you want to play with composition in the vertical space, or I do. But part of this was so you could see somebody signing while somebody was maybe standing in front of them. So there are really practical concerns to all of this, and then the kind of artistic piece of it. So this is hair. It was kind of all about planets and orbs and spheres and playground, and I was really working in this sort of pop art tie-dye thing. So we had to paint this all to look like tie-dye, right? You can't, this is 45 feet by 25 feet, so hard to do that. Yes, sir.
Ask, do you have sketches of that particular scene?
I do somewhere, but not here.
Okay.
Yeah, sorry. Go ahead. So there was all kinds. So at one point, this thing opens up. It was supposed to look like the back end of a school bus. It always looked more like just the garage door than it was. But at one point, this thing opens up and this platform rolls out, and it's basically a version of the Supremes are on here. And we flew in this mylar. They call it a rain curtain. So there's that. All of this stuff lit up. At a certain point, they're on this LSD acid trip, and all of this stuff was painted with UV day-glow paint. So that was the one time I got to have like some crazy color going on in there. So I love this play. A really fascinating play about Heisenberg and. Anyway, the one guy wins, Heisenberg, right, nuclear physicist. He stays and works with the Germans. The other guy, oh God, bless America, why can't I remember his name? He actually comes to the U.S. and helps develop the bomb, wins a Nobel Peace, Niels Bohr. Ends up winning a Nobel Peace Prize, right? This play is all about their relationship. They're both dead. Now they're in purgatory, and they relive this meeting that they had in Copenhagen. And when I first sat down to read this play, I'm like, seriously, a play about two nuclear physicists? How boring. It's one of the most fascinating plays I have ever worked on. And one of the most frightening things was there was a group of nuclear physicists who like bought out the house one night and came to see the show. And I had written all of these formulas up here, right? To me, they're just hieroglyphs. It's like wallpaper. And the best compliment I got was that it all made sense. And in fact, the progression of how we had put it, which was a complete accident. So when I said earlier it's all planned, it's like, yes, I planned to put these up here. But the other thing I loved about it, let's see if we can, yeah, you can't, it's hard to see it. Not to get down too far, there's something called the Heisenberg principle. And it basically is once you start to look at and study something, the moment you do that, it changes. Right? That only for a moment do you get this sort of glimpse. And I was trying to figure out how the heck did I put that in here. So in between each of these textured sort of blackboard panels, and all of this came from this research of seeing these guys standing at blackboards figuring this out. Right? In between each of these is a strip of black acrylic plexiglass, which when there's no light on it looks black. As soon as something that is lit passes in front of it, it acts like a mirror. So as they walked by here, you would occasionally get a glimpse of a reflection. Like, what was that? And it was the closest thing visually I could get to, like, putting the Heisenberg. And I don't get the Heisenberg. I'm a designer, I'm an artist, I'm not a physicist. So I kind of understand it, but that was a visual metaphor for that. So Spitfire Grill, okay, takes place in the woods. Go ahead. Anyway, well, we'll just leave it with these, and I'm sorry, I should see if there are any more questions. This is really a small sample. I also have, there's some stuff from the Ballet production of Dracula, which I designed, which is up here. Here are a couple of little models for a production of Julius Caesar that I did up at Otterbein. This is just like this, instead of doing a sketch, I did this. Because I had this idea about this collapsed ruin of an Italian building. And it was easier for me to figure it out like this than try to do a sketch of it, and then it turned into this.
Good question.
Yeah.
So, like when you were talking about the Heisenberg in that class, how much do you think of yourself as a scientist who has to figure out what materials can do for you? Or do you have a class you go to as professional development, or?
No, but Dan, part of it is sometimes I think more about what I do is like logic or geometry, right? It's like there's a problem in it to be solved, and like it has these variables. And part of it is, as soon as I can start taking out some of the variables, like the most frightening part is when I sit down and any of you who've ever made art of any kind know this, like you sit down when anything is possible, right? Blank sheet of whatever in front of you. As soon as I can start taking some of that away and get to the core of like, here's the idea, but that actually, honestly, I don't remember exactly. I had done another show where we had these reflective surfaces, and I just kept trying to think of, because I knew the piece about the surround and the sort of perspective. And the other part of that one was it's supposed to look like the catacombs at Hamlet's castle in Copenhagen. That's the nature of that. But I don't think of myself as a scientist, but I'm like a visual problem solver. And Mary will tell you this, like, I'll be walking through Lowe's, I'm like, oh, you know, I could use that, and I'm terrified. The worst is when the guys at Lowe's come up to me and like, what are you going to use it for? Not that.
I think though it's more about the artist as an observer. Like we are the best observers, I think. And you store qualities. So somewhere you probably saw that reflective quality somewhere in a building or something, and we just store that stuff. And as observers, then we just put it out as art.
And one of the things I've always said about part of it is I do all of this research and I have to sort of let it, I don't know what it's going to be, right, until I start kind of having the conversations and thinking about the play. And some of it's really practical, right? There's that door. Somebody crashes through this, not very practical. Somebody crashes through the ceiling. You know, I mean, it's just some of the stuff that has to happen. But I've often said, if I could like describe and put into print in a book how that thing like and when that thing happened, I would be rich. Yes, sir.
You know, the set designers, they're working with feeling and emotions. Probably the hardest thing to get to the public is the soul of that, the stage.
Yeah, and
you know, you're artists of basically feelings and emotions.
And you know, it's like I know how it feels to me, right? And I make certain assumptions about how this might, but I cannot predict how. I did a show once, I thought I nailed this thing. One of my best friends in the world, we were talking about it afterward, and the whole set was blue. Right? And I was so proud of this, and I was like, what do you think?
What was the story about? What was it?
House of Blue Leaves. And yeah, one of Dan's design made simple. If it's Anne of Green Gables, you might want to think about a green bay lot. But I'm talking to her like, what it got down to is like, yeah, I don't like blue. All right, well, you know, it makes sense to a few people. Anyway, any other questions?
Yes, when someone wants you to design a set or a scene, and they're very specific, how do you transform their thoughts, their ideas, you, and build that set? Based on their?
Yeah, it's an interesting collaboration, and really, I've worked with directors who have very specific visions, right? And I learned pretty early on, it's like, it's not my job to change their mind, right?
So how do you create their mind? Because that's what you do.
Well, if it's that specific, I don't want the job. Honestly, you know, it's like, you don't need me then. You need like an interior designer and somebody who can like draw some plans. But what I try to do then is because I have an opinion, right? And my assumption is that people are hiring me because I bring something to the conversation. And I've said this a lot. It's like, I don't make backgrounds for plays. I make interactive environments that are a character in the play, right? Because when you walked into Bengal Tiger at the Baghdad Zoo, there was not an actor on the stage, right? You heard the sounds, you saw the set, you saw lighting. So before any actor walks out there, you're already starting to tell the story. So what I try to get to is, here's my understanding of the story. I think this is what you are saying as a director. Here's how I can support that, right? But my friend Mo, who directed Bengal Tiger, she'd get all kind of frustrated with our students who were like, just tell me what you want. What she wants is you to think about how to show us this idea. Because if she knew how to do it, she would do it. But part of it is, but I will also say one of the worst projects I ever worked on was the director who had not done their homework. They thought they were paying me a big compliment by saying, "Oh, Dan, I don't know, just do whatever you want." It's like, that is not helpful.
Oh, man.
Because I know at some point.
Magnificent. Thank you.